Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, we are now today in another episode with Lauren Ferro. But before we introduce Lauren, can you tell us, Lauren, if you're prepared to engage?
Of course, I'm ready and I'm waiting to start.
Let's go, because Lauren has a Ph.D. in player profiling and modeling. She is currently an adjunct professor and researcher at Sapienza University in Rome. She's also the co-organizer of the Unreal Engine Meetup in Rome. And as you probably guessed, she is mostly in Rome by now. In addition, she created the game design resource Gamicards, which is a prototyping tool for game experience. And at heart, she is intrigued by how we interact with the world and those in it. So, Lauren, is there anything that we missed from that fantastic intro?
No, I think that sums me up in a nutshell quite nicely.
Sounds great. So, Lauren, can you tell us what does we like to call it regular days, but I know sometimes that doesn't fit the schedules of most of our guests. But what does being in the life with Lauren Ferro look like?
It's very interesting, let's say that much. I think a regular day, I think everyone in the world of game design can agree there is no regular day. But I think for me, it depends on what projects that I'm working on. So recently, I've been sort of working on a few academic projects and a few sort of client-side things. So what that usually involves is that in the morning, I'll start with things that are a lot more complicated or complex. So if there's been sort of an issue, say with blueprints, if I'm working in Unreal, I'll spend that morning like tackling those type of things, because I know that by the afternoon, as all of us, we're sort of a little bit more slower. So then I will probably shift gears and exactly. So I'll probably work in something a little bit more relaxed. So I'll do reading, I'll do some research, maybe I'll do some paper writing. And then towards the end of the day, again, if I'll start working again and say on projects, like I might still do some, if I'm working in the modeling section of a project, or if I'm doing other parts of it, texturing or whatever, then I'll work on that. So what I tend to try and leave the middle part of the day for more sort of less demanding tasks. I'll do emails, I'll do calls and things, and then leave the start of the day and the end of the day for things that require a lot more attention and focus. So
that's a good way to structure your day, which is already a difficult thing to have very clear outlook of what you want from your day, right?
Yeah, especially when you're working with people from all around the world, you also have to factor in the time zones. So I think that's also a challenge for a lot of us. So I think in that structure, especially in early morning and late nights, you have the ability to also be available for people perhaps like in Australia or in the US. So that kind of structure helps a lot with those kinds of things.
Yes, that makes sense. It does. Yeah. So, Lauren, we want to shift gears a little bit and start by some interesting moments in your life. And we like to call this moment your favorite fail or first attempt in learning. Yeah. A time when, you wanted to do something, it didn't go exactly as you were expecting. And you had this, you experienced this fail moment. And then, of course, how did you come out of it? Maybe what did you learn from that? Can you tell us that story? We want to be there with you, Lauren.
Okay. I like this question a lot, because I think people have they have such a stigma against the concept of failure. And for me, my favorite failure was when I first started out doing consulting work, mostly for gamified projects. And it was, a really interesting experience, I think, for me and for the person I was working with, where for us, as researchers, as consultants, we have a very clear idea about what game design is or what a gamified experience is. And for me, I made the mistake of assuming that the person that I was working with, let's say, had the same basic understanding of what a gamified experience has. And a few months into the project, we're working away, we're developing ideas, and everything seemed to be going right. And then we're developing it. And then when it got to the, let's say, the preliminary testing, it was like there was this really awkward sort of situation where it's like, this is nothing like what I was imagining. You know, this is like the graphics are not like this, and the game doesn't work like it should. And when we sat down and we kind of like reverse engineered the problems, and we tried to understand why, you know, perhaps my vision and the client's vision wasn't quite aligned, I found out that the concept of what they had for gamification, the concept of what they had for serious games, for educational games, for simulations, it was very, very different to mine. So to answer the question, my favorite failure was learning this, that we have very, very different perspectives. And this is not like, this wasn't the first case, and I'm assuming it won't be the last. But for me, it was a very important lesson, because what I found that from subsequent projects, you have to, and even if, say, your own definition is very different to, say, like another consultant's definition, regardless of that, it was very important from that point forward for other projects that you have, that you and your client or whoever you're working with, your team, have the very same definitions, or at least a common understanding. And I know it sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many situations have this problem. So yeah, that was my, let's say, favorite failure.
Wow, that's very interesting. I have a friend who once told me it's already difficult for two people to be speaking and understand each other. Like, imagine if that's already challenging. Imagine how challenging it is for the people to understand the same thing from that message, and that's already a challenge, right?
Especially, for when it comes to gamification, because, you know, at least this is my perspective, and like, no one shoot me for this, but when you have gamification, the concept is very much focused on, let's say, encouraging or influencing a particular behavior, because obviously at the end of a gamified experience, we want someone to develop a habit or to change a way of thinking, you know, through gamified or through game elements. Where, you know, in a serious game or an educational game or a simulation, they have very, very different principles. Okay, so I think that having, like, managing this definition, because it also influences your design approaches, is very important, especially if you want, one, the client to be happy, because again, at the end of the whole thing, that's our ultimate goal, and two, for the design process to flow nicely and the end user to be quite, like, happy, and that the end product is coherent and it makes sense. So. Yeah,
that part's also difficult.
Yes, very. That takes skill, that for sure.
Absolutely. So that's a fantastic learning. Like, getting the two people involved, or the two organizations involved, to understand the same thing and hold the same expectations as well from what a project will look like, at least in general terms. Like, what does it mean that I'm going to work with you, and what's the product and the result that you're expecting? That is a fundamental alignment from day one.
Absolutely.
I completely agree, and I know you've been doing things slightly different since that experience, and gathering from that experience, I'm sure you've had a lot of success, and we know you've had a lot of success in many areas and many projects. But I'd like for you to tell us also a story of a time that you set out to do something using, you know, gamification, your understanding as well of game design and so on, and you crafted it and it made sense, and it was exactly what you were looking for. Like, you had a complete success with that project. Can you again guide us through that experience that you had and take us, you know, to the ground level? We want to be there with you.
Sure. So this was a project that I worked on, about 5 or 6 years ago. And the core of the project was to get educators who were not using technology as part of their lesson plan. So they weren't using things like smart boards, or they weren't using things like interactive discussions, and like, you know, when you can have Twitter and people can write questions and responses during a class session, and then you can sort of draw on that and expand upon that. And this was a big issue because the lecturers were using what was called next generation classrooms. So they were basically classrooms that were completely equipped with touch screens, with smart boards, with all like the latest technology. And the problem was that a lot of the lecturers, they were, I don't want to say old, but they were sort of stuck in traditional methods of teaching. So the ones that they wanted to use, like like the chalkboard or the whiteboard, or, you know, some of them use lecture slides or maybe not at all. Like they were very much accustomed to providing lessons, you know, just like by talking. And for some people, this works fantastically. But you have to also understand that in a situation where a lot of the students, you know, they're on their smartphones or on, you know, tablets, they're taking notes on their iPads, like they're engaged with technology. There is this expectation that, you know, lessons should also kind of adapt to this change in like media usage. So our job was to find a way to not only educate these lecturers about the technology, but also to provide them and encourage them in ways to adopt this technology. So this was very challenging because like a lot of the lecturers, they don't play games, right? So they're not really like even basic games or basic apps like Candy Crush or just mobile games in general. None of them engaged with these things. So you have to imagine trying to get these people to play or engage in a gamified experience is going to be quite hard. So what I decided to do was say, look, all right, you know, what's the general demographics of who we're designing for, right? You know, you're looking at a lot of, you know, people from baby boomer generations, the 50s, the 60s. And, you know, what were the kind of things that they were interested in? What kind of games did they play? What kind of experiences did they have that they found enjoyable? So then from here, we started to align, you know, the different incentives. So we weren't so much focused on badges or points, but we were sort of more focused on, you know, let's say a raffle kind of orientated mechanic, or where they could, you know, do things, or they try and present lesson plans with the option to win something like a gift voucher to have coffee, or, you know, a free lunch or something at the cafeteria. And I mean, these type of situations exist in things like, you know, loyalty reward programs. But why I think it was important in this situation was because it actually aligned more with the type of, let's say, gamified experiences that they were more interested, or they aligned with in a more personal way, rather than, oh, they get a badge. You know, for them, you know, a badge is nothing in comparison to perhaps, you know, more like the newer generations of people. So again, we had to try and align this. And again, we also had to, you know, give them this understanding about why technology is good. And a lot of them, we found out they had the fear of using that technology. It's like, oh, you know, it's fine to teach them what it's capable of. It's fine to teach them how to use it. But then they were worried, like, oh, what happens if something breaks? Like, what happens if something goes down and I built my entire lesson? Like, how do I mitigate this? How do I change this? You know, how do I adapt my lesson, you know, if something stops working? So then we sort of had to find ways to try and ease them into, you know, without overwhelming them, that, you know, what to do in case technology fails, and make sure we provided them with all the support and all the instructions. And we managed to also implement this into part of that whole gamified like app that we developed. And it was really interesting to see, because also during the development process, we involved them, we included them, and we showed them how we were developing the app, and we asked them for their input and asked them whether or not that they found what we were doing was interesting, or was it boring, or was it, you know. And we found that by the end of it, I mean, not all the teachers were completely convinced or on board with, you know, adopting this technology into their classrooms, or using that in ways that, you know, made their content more contemporary. But we did manage to create a dialogue and an understanding, which a lot of other teachers also built upon. So I think for that was the biggest challenge when we had to use game thinking, was how can we address an audience that really aren't, or never grew up, or never really have an experience with games like we have. So, yeah.
Completely different demographics, and
completely different, and it was a huge challenge, because you can't just dive in and say, oh, let's add like a badge to this, let's add some points, you know, that'll be right. You can't do that. You have to think outside the box, because also the rewards, or the badges, the points, whatever it is, it doesn't necessarily have to be digital, which in our case wasn't. You know, they'd get like a notification once they submitted their lesson plan, and then the physical, their incentive or the reward was physical. Like they'd get a voucher, or they'd get like an opportunity to, you know, like a competition type thing where they had the opportunity to get like a free lunch or something like that. So, yeah, and this is another consideration when developing gamified things. You can have a digital app, but the rewards can also extend into the physical realm.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, Lauren, I think there's a lot of learning there, especially regarding that type of demographic who you felt was definitely not into games as like more recent generations are. I'm sure they're into fun and into playing different things, but that's exactly the challenge, that you've been used to doing certain things, and then these professors or these teachers come up and they say, well, that's not my thing. And what do? You have to come up with new solutions. And that
Exactly.
sounds like a very, very adapted and great solution. And talking about that, about those solutions that you create, Lauren, is there any process, any series of steps? What do you do when a project comes up? Like, what are the steps? How do you approach a project that has a need of gamification and game thinking?
The first thing, I stick by this so much. Don't even think about the game. Don't even think about how you're going to gamify it. Throw all that out the window. The first thing I really suggest people start with is, who are you designing for? And this will tell you so much. And it's exactly like what I was just saying. I mean, a lot of people, you feel the need, and I'm not saying this is the case for everyone, but you feel like you want to start designing, you have all these ideas, and you'll find that once you start learning who your audience are, that a lot of the ideas won't work. And they won't work for various reasons. Again, maybe they don't align with the demographic, maybe they're too ambitious for whatever reason. And I always start with the user. And even if you cannot find a lot of information, maybe you don't have that option for whether it's because of time, whether it's because of funding, and you don't have that option to ask more in-depth demographic questions, what you can do, and I say this to my students too when they're developing games or they're developing experiences that are to be in different for different audiences, is try and find as much information on apps that are similar even. So for instance, say you're developing the next gen Duolingo, okay? Find out what kind of demographics that's targeting. Find out as much as you can about that audience. What do they like? What do they not like? And, you can find a lot of data, a lot of this information just by reading the comment section of app reviews. And, you can find out whether, in some cases, and this is I'm talking about not just on the App Store or on the Play Store with Android, also in some other platforms, you have sort of basic demographics. Maybe you have the age or you have the gender. And then you can start to compile, even if it's a brief demographic, let's say demographic report of your audience, you can then start to think about the game design or the gamified solution. Because again, you don't want to get halfway and you've created this really, it might be a fantastic application, might be a fantastic game, it looks wonderful. And then you find out your audience doesn't really care for it. You've wasted time, you've wasted money, you've wasted, energy on something that's not going to be successful. And I think that this step about the user is probably the most important. Of course, if you have that luxury where you can do a complete demographic analysis, you'd have to do it, but you also then need to think about as well your end user, what are the specific things you need to know about them? If what type of factors you need to take into consideration. For example, do they have enough time to play your game or gamified experience? Or are they required to have a lot of time available? And, besides, these are also, because you have to take a different approach to traditional game design too, where, you have a game and, you can play it and you can play it for an hour, you can play it for 10 minutes. It's really no big deal. But with a gamified experience, you're wanting that user to come back. You want them to, constantly feel let's say, incentivized, right, to continue that experience. So you need to understand what entices them, what draws them in. And with that said, once you've started developing it, once you've included that demographic part into the design process, as soon as you possibly can, I really I suggest that people do user testing. And, it doesn't have to be completely in-depth, QA where, you're checking for every single bug or every single thing. It can be just one section of an application just to see if, how it feels for the user to use. Like, do they feel that this is something that they could engage with?
And the sooner the better, right?
Exactly. Like there was a project that I was working on where this never happened until the late stages of development. And fortunately enough for us, there wasn't a lot to change. But there were a lot of things that, the user wasn't completely comfortable with. And there were minor things, but there were things that we could have caught early on that could have helped to improve things like the UI interaction. Right, because again, it's not just about game design. It's also about interaction design, because it's not a traditional game, and you often with mobiles too, you're reliant completely on the UI in terms of that's going to be a very big part of that experience. So you have to understand, you have to know how that feels. So I think, the process that I would take would, you start with the user, try and understand them as much as possible, and then influence your game design with that. Don't try and design the game and then adapt it to your user. It's not going, I personally don't think it's going to end well. And then from there, test as often as you can with as diverse range of people that fits your user demographic. And keep doing that. Keep, as each time you iterate, like big changes, try and get people to evaluate and see how that feels, and then develop, continue to develop until you're finished.
That makes a lot of sense, and especially given that you are a PhD in player profiling.
Yeah, perhaps I'm too pedantic when it comes to the user, but I think, really, we're designing for people. We're designing for them.
We're designing for humans.
So,
yeah,
exactly. For now,
I completely agree. It was just a pun. Don't worry. I agree. It's like a central thing, and I think I don't think there's the first person who's come to this section and not mentioned the importance of the user. At whatever stage it is, but I do, and I completely agree. If you don't know who you're designing with, you can't design. So
no, you're going in blind. And this actually, it was another project that I worked on, and they're like, oh, we have to make this project fun. It has to be fun. And it's like, yeah, but what you find fun and what other people find fun are two totally different things. And again, this is actually the same project I was talking about before, where we could change a few things, but if we learned early on, because we'd been driven so much of what the person had found fun, that we lost track of what the actual user was going to find fun. So yeah,
absolutely. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. So Lauren, we're going to move on now. We're going to move from story mode into other types of questions. And the first one would be, is if there's something that you would consider, that any gamification or game design project would benefit from, or sort of a best practice, so to speak. Is there such an, element strategy? What would you say is a best practice in this area?
This actually extends about what I was just saying. Just don't go in with the intention to make something fun. Like, this fun should be like the result of what you're designing, but it shouldn't be what's driving it. I think with gamification projects, focus first on achieving the goals, right? Like, say, I'll come back to the Duolingo example. Say you want to achieve, like, someone to learn a language, all right, and you want them to learn it in a really simplistic way. All right, develop your application so that it achieves this, and then look at how can we improve this? How can we, incentivize the user? And if you look at things like Duolingo, where, they got the points and they got like those little badges and those kind of things, and you can upgrade, the character. They're very simple. It's not a lot of stuff, and I think that works really effective, and it doesn't interrupt the process, the learning process. So I think, focus more on what you're trying to achieve first, and then sort of look at that, adding that extra layer of enjoyment for the player.
Beautiful. Absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. And in that same sense of best practices, what would you say is your favorite game?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm going to answer this in three ways. My favorite game of all time would be Abe's Odyssey. Simply for the fact that if it wasn't for that game, I would never have gotten into the world of game or game design in general. Because, I mean, this was like, 20 years ago, I think, when I first played that, and it was just like a whole new world, right? And from there, I would have to say then Assassin's Creed, the first one, for the simple fact that when I had finished that game, the amount of tangential learning that I had done from that for me, that's what really inspired me and really opened up the potential of what games can have for people. Because, and it's the same thing like when you play like Civilization and other games like that, where you just have that kind of, that learning entwines with what you're actually doing. And I think that's really, really, really powerful. And then my favorite game at the moment, because I can't limit it to just one, but is my favorite game at the moment, which I just finished, is Detroit. And that game really, really challenges the way that you think about a future with androids. And I think it challenges you morally and ethically. So it's definitely something that I think everyone should experience.
Wow.
It's a very, very dynamic narrative. So.
And also in the sense of challenges, I want to challenge you to tell me, who would you like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game?
Perhaps it's a little biased, but for me, Alessandro Canossa. He was someone that when I was doing my PhD, I read a lot of his stuff, and I really he's very much more like me, like player profiling and modeling. But I think he has a lot of interesting perspectives when it comes to, understanding the player as part of a game design process. So, yeah, I would suggest him.
We're all biased, so that's fine.
Yeah, that's okay then.
If you would have to also recommend a book to the audience, to the engagers, what would that book be and why?
This one's a little easier than my favorite game, thankfully. I would recommend The Alchemist. It's probably one of the few books that after I've read it, you really kind of, it helps you to place things into perspective. And without giving too much away, it's a book about this shepherd that goes on this journey based on a dream, like this recurring dream that he had. And, it's a journey to find this treasure. But of course, like most stories, lots of things happen along the way. But it's how it's described, like how these events that happen along the way, how they're described, how they've influenced the journey. And I think that, we all have like this concept of, I think for being in our comfort zone, we're used to what we're doing. And I think this book illustrates why it's so important to get outside of that. Why it's so important to get outside of the things that you're that you're used to, and to really, you're going to have bad experiences to learn good things. I mean, of course, we all have to have a favorite failure at some point. So, I think it's really,
it's part of the journey.
Exactly. And I think that this book illustrates that perfectly.
That's fantastic. That's the book by Paulo Coelho, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a great book. It's a great book for sure. And what would you say, Lauren, is your superpower when you're creating these games, these gamified experiences? What would you say is that, that sweet spot, that great thing that you do?
Oh, wow. I think my superpower is being able to think in a very abstract way, because I've played so many games. I probably spent too much time playing games.
There's never too much.
That's good then. Yeah, because I think this has given me like a really good way to think outside the box that looks beyond, your typical approaches to gamified experiences. Because you can think, this happened in I don't know, like this game, and we could try and use something like that and adapt it accordingly, because I think it'd be perfect. I think that's given me like a lot of thinking outside the box kind of experience, let's say, for developing gamified things.
It's a superpower for sure.
Yeah.
And now we're going to move on to this sort of gamified-ish question, in which the audience gives us questions. I have my role here is simply to filter if there's anything that doesn't make any sense, or if, these kinds of things. And then randomly we find a question during the episode and we hand you the question. So this question comes from Vazel, I'm not sure how your name is pronounced. I'm sorry about that. But Vasil or Vasil is asking, I would love to know more about using gamification in business and enterprise software. Do any good examples come to mind? Lauren, the microphone is all yours.
Oh, business enterprise. I mean, I will be honest, this is not my, let's say, area of expertise.
Okay.
But business. I mean, I worked in business and enterprise things, but I can't talk about them.
Okay.
Loyalty.
You've brought some inspiration from other ones who have done it as well.
No, of course. I think loyalty, when it comes to business enterprise loyalty schemes are probably one of the most dynamic, because I have seen so many different experience, like let's say different perspectives, because not all of them are centered around points. Things are centered around like what you buy. Things are centered around like recommendation systems. Like there's a whole bunch of different dynamics that are influencing these systems. Again, probably because I'm very interested and I use it. These type of things also, like depending on also how they're designed, they can vary quite a lot. So I think, oh God, I'm trying to think, because I'm not, like there's a lot of, like, for instance, flybys. I know in Australia, that's a very nice way that because it extends beyond just shopping. Like you also have the ability to get like other rewards. I think that's very well organized, also because it's quite personalized. I mean, you also look at things like, the fast food chains where they have their apps, and they'll have like different types of events depending on how much you buy or what you buy or when you buy, more importantly. So I think that, yeah, those kind of enterprisal like things are quite effective. Yeah.
Those are good examples for sure. For sure. And you were mentioning, for example, the Duolingo. That's a classic example.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Definitely. So thank you very much for that answer, Vasil. I hope you had brought some of those examples and that they're at the forefront for you to get inspiration as well into the future. And Lauren, we're arriving to the end of the interview today, but before you leave, can you give us any final piece of advice you want to leave the engagers with? Let us know where we can find you, and of course anything else you want to say before saying goodbye, and then we'll say it's game over.
Okay. Some quick advice. If you're starting out with gamified or gamification, anything like that, play games. I really, and I cannot emphasize that enough, really try and understand how they work. Like whether it's playing Candy Crush, whether it's Duolingo, whether it's, playing Call of Duty or whatever, like really understand how the mechanics and the dynamics work in games. And I don't mean like also play different genres, play different types of experiences. Don't just play like first person shooters. Play things that are heavily based on narrative, play things that are heavily based on role playing. And I really think that that's going to it's going to benefit how you approach design. It's also going to broaden your design toolbox, let's say, because it's going to give you other ways that you can develop or use the same type of game elements. Like points don't always have to be associated with actions. Like you can use points in very different ways to unlock parts of an experience, to level up, because I think this is really important. I think that this is something that really that really helps people to expand approaches so that they're not all like the same, if that makes sense. So we can sort of think beyond, the traditional uses for these things.
Yeah, it opens up your mind to new things as well.
Exactly.
So Lauren, where can you find you in the world of the internet?
You can find me on Twitter. It's, I don't know if I should say it, R3NE. It's Renzer, but instead of an E, it's 3. So, and if you just Google my name, you'll find a lot of stuff. So
yes, definitely. Yep. That's
Google
how we
me.
met as well.
Yeah.
Definitely. So thank you very much, Lauren, for this time that we've spent together. Thank you for providing all of these insights for the engagers, all your experience, all your stories, insights, and so on. However, for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over.
Oh, well, it was nice playing. Thank you, Rob.
You're welcome. Hey, engagers. Thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Lauren. Do you have any questions that you would like to ask future guests? Then go to professorgame.com/question and ask your question. If it is selected, it will come up in a future episode and you'll get your answer. And before you go to your next mission, would you like to know what does a hotel for gamers and geeks like ourselves, like some of ourselves at least, look like, and what does it feel like, and what is it all about? And then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.